The public health nurse had been in the emergency department for 11 hours when she noticed the pattern. Not the heat itself, which everyone in the department was dealing with, not the elevated body temperatures or the confusion or the dehydration that were presenting in a steady stream through the doors, but something in the ages. She had worked 7 previous major heat events in her career, had been on the front lines of 2 of them that were classified as catastrophic by the public health authorities afterward, and she had developed, over those 7 events, a professional familiarity with who shows up in an emergency department during a heat wave. Elderly people living alone in apartments without air conditioning. People with cardiovascular disease whose compensatory mechanisms are compromised. Outdoor workers who had not been adequately protected by their employers. People with mental illness whose medications impaired their thermoregulation or whose circumstances made access to cooling impossible. The most vulnerable members of the community, arriving in the familiar pattern that a major heat wave always produced. What she was seeing in the 11th hour of her shift was different. The elderly and the chronically ill were there, as they always were. But alongside them, in proportions that did not match any of the previous 7 events in her experience, were people who did not fit the vulnerability profile that shaped the standard public health response to heat. Working-age adults in good health who had been exercising outdoors and had simply overheated. Young adults who had been in their apartments and who had been confident that the conditions were manageable because previous heat events had been manageable in comparable circumstances. A family with a 4-year-old who had been at an outdoor event in the afternoon and who had been observed for symptoms and sent home and had returned 3 hours later in a significantly worse condition than when they left. The standard vulnerability categories were present. But people outside those categories were also there, and they were there in numbers that she had not seen in 7 previous heat events. She mentioned it to the attending physician on her break. He said that he had been thinking about the same thing for the past few hours. He said that the cases in front of them were not behaving quite the way that heat illness cases typically behaved, that some of the presentations suggested a progression from mild to severe that was faster than he had been trained to expect, and that the ambient temperature at which some of the cases were occurring, cases in people who were not in the extreme vulnerability categories, was lower than the temperature at which he would have predicted serious heat illness in otherwise healthy adults. He said that he did not have a good explanation for it, and that he was going to write it up for the department's quality improvement report. What he and the nurse were observing in the emergency department, without yet having the context to understand it, was one of the first visible human consequences of something that the atmospheric scientists monitoring the heat wave had been discussing among themselves for 2 days. The heat wave was not behaving normally. It was not simply a hot period of above-average temperatures, which is the standard definition of a heat wave and the context in which public health thresholds and emergency response protocols had been calibrated. It was behaving differently from normal in specific, measurable, physically explicable ways that made it more dangerous than its peak temperature values alone would suggest, ways that the standard heat wave monitoring and communication frameworks were not designed to capture and convey. Heat is not a single thing. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the heat wave that is currently affecting large parts of the world, and that is generating the scientific concern that it is generating. When news reports describe a heat wave as producing record high temperatures of 42 degrees Celsius or 107 degrees Fahrenheit, they are describing one dimension of the thermal environment that human beings are experiencing. They are not describing the full thermal environment. The full thermal environment includes at least 4 other dimensions that the peak air temperature does not capture, and that can substantially amplify or attenuate the actual heat stress experienced by people in those conditions. The first additional dimension is humidity. The mechanism by which the human body loses heat in hot conditions is primarily evaporative cooling, the evaporation of sweat from the skin surface. Evaporation requires that the atmosphere be able to absorb moisture from the skin, and the ability of the atmosphere to absorb moisture is directly limited by how much moisture is already present, measured as the relative humidity. In dry conditions, evaporative cooling is efficient, and the body can maintain thermal homeostasis, the stable internal body temperature over approximately 37 degrees Celsius, in air temperatures well above that value. In humid conditions, evaporative cooling is impaired, and the body's ability to shed heat is reduced in proportion to the impairment. The combination of air temperature and humidity that determines the actual physiological heat stress is captured by various metrics, of which the wet bulb temperature, a specific combination of temperature and humidity that directly represents the minimum temperature to which a surface can be cooled by evaporation, is the most physically meaningful. The current heat wave is producing wet bulb temperatures in certain regions that are approaching, and in some locations have briefly exceeded the theoretical maximum that the human body can survive indefinitely, regardless of fitness level or health status. This threshold, approximately 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature, is not a commonly discussed metric in standard heat wave communication. Most heat wave advisories and heat health warnings are framed in terms of the air temperature, occasionally supplemented by the heat index, which combines temperature and humidity, but in a way that is calibrated for average outdoor conditions rather than for the specific physiological conditions of indoor environments or of people engaged in physical activity. The wet bulb temperature, which captures the thermodynamic limit on the body's ability to shed heat through sweating, is the metric that the physiological research suggests is most directly relevant to the extreme end of heat stress risk, and it is the metric that the current heat wave is pushing into territory that previous heat waves in the affected regions have not previously reached. The second additional dimension is nighttime temperature. The standard public health understanding of heat wave risk emphasizes the importance of nighttime cooling, the drop in temperature that occurs after sunset, and that allows the body to recover from the heat stress of the day, the core body temperature to return to normal, and the cumulative physiological burden of sustained heat exposure to be partially relieved. Heat waves that produce high nighttime temperatures that do not allow the normal nocturnal cooling are substantially more dangerous than heat waves with comparable peak daytime temperatures that allow adequate nighttime recovery. The current heat wave is producing nighttime temperatures that are anomalously high relative to the daytime peak temperatures, maintaining conditions that limit the body's recovery window in a way that is causing the cumulative physiological burden of the heat exposure to be substantially larger than the peak temperature values alone would suggest. The third additional dimension is duration. The physiological impact of heat stress is not proportional to the instantaneous temperature at any moment. It is proportional to the cumulative heat load experienced over time, the integral of the heat stress across the entire period of exposure. A heat wave that produces 3 days of moderately elevated temperatures, followed by 3 days of severely elevated temperatures, is not the same as a heat wave that produces 6 days of severely elevated temperatures, even if the peak temperatures are identical, because the 3 days of moderate elevation in the first case have been partially or fully tolerated, and the body's physiological resources are not yet depleted when the severe phase begins. The current heat wave is in its 7th consecutive day of above-threshold temperatures in the most affected regions, with no significant cooling period in the forecast through at least the next 5 days. The cumulative heat load that people in the most affected areas are experiencing is therefore substantially larger than the peak temperature values on any individual day would suggest. And the physiological resources that allow the body to cope with heat stress are being progressively depleted in ways that increase vulnerability, even in people whose health status would not normally place them in the high-risk categories. The fourth additional dimension is the rate at which the hot conditions developed. Heat waves that arrive rapidly with temperatures jumping to extreme levels in a short period are more dangerous than heat waves that develop gradually, because the physiological and behavioral acclimatization that reduces heat stress risk requires time to develop and has not had time to occur when conditions change abruptly. The current heat wave developed from near normal temperatures to extreme temperatures in approximately 36 hours, a rate that is substantially faster than the development of previous major heat waves in the affected regions, and that left the population with little time to acclimatize or to implement the behavioral adaptations that reduce heat stress risk. It is the combination of these 4 dimensions, the high humidity reducing the efficiency of sweating, the anomalously high nighttime temperatures limiting recovery, the extended duration depleting physiological reserves, and the rapid onset preventing acclimatization, acting simultaneously on a population that has not been educated or warned about the specific character of this event, that is producing the emergency department presentations that the nurse noticed were different from previous heat events. Each of these dimensions individually would represent an elevated but manageable risk. Together, they are producing a heat event that is significantly more dangerous than its peak temperature values suggest, in ways that the standard heatwave communication frameworks were not designed to convey. The atmospheric scientists who are responsible for monitoring and forecasting the current heat wave have been aware of its unusual character since the event began. The scientific discussion within the meteorological and atmospheric research community has been focused on 2 related but distinct questions. The first question is, what is causing the heat wave to have this specific combination of characteristics that makes it more dangerous than standard heat events of comparable peak temperature? The second question is whether the unusual character of the current event reflects a specific and relatively unusual combination of circumstances, or whether it reflects a change in how heat waves form and behave that has been occurring gradually, and that makes current heat waves systematically different from the historical ones. The first question has been addressed in part through the analysis of the large-scale atmospheric configuration that is driving the event. The heat wave is associated with a persistent high-pressure blocking pattern, an anticyclonic ridge that has been stalled over the affected region for more than a week, and that is producing the descending, compressing, warming motion of air that is the standard mechanism for extreme heat episodes. The blocking pattern itself is not unusual in its broad character. High-pressure blocking events that produce heat extremes have occurred in this region in previous years and decades. What is unusual is the specific configuration of the pattern, particularly the way it is interacting with the regional geography and the boundary layer moisture to produce the combination of high temperature, high humidity, high nighttime temperatures, and rapid onset that characterizes the current event. The high humidity component is directly related to the blocking pattern's interaction with the moisture supply from the regional ocean and from the regional land surface. The anticyclonic circulation around the blocking high is channeling unusually warm and moist air from the adjacent ocean into the heated continental interior, a flow pattern that is combining the extreme dryness and high temperature of the deep interior with a moisture supply that is elevating the humidity in the boundary layer. The result is an air mass that has characteristics of both a dry continental heat mass with its high temperatures and a maritime tropical air mass with its high moisture content, a combination that is thermodynamically unusual, and that is producing the high wet bulb temperatures that are the most dangerous aspect of the current event. The high nighttime temperatures are a consequence of two compounding factors. The first is the elevated sea surface temperatures in the adjacent ocean, which are warming the air masses that flow into the region and limiting the ability of the nocturnal boundary layer to cool to the temperatures that historical experience would predict for overnight cooling under the current daytime peak conditions. The second is the enhanced downward long-wave radiation from the warm, moist atmosphere, which reduces the rate of nocturnal surface cooling by providing a source of infrared radiation that partially offsets the surface's tendency to radiate heat to space during the clear sky conditions that are characteristic of a high-pressure blocking event. The combination of warm advection from the ocean and enhanced atmospheric back radiation is producing nighttime temperature minima that are 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer than what the same blocking pattern would have produced in the same region in previous decades when the ocean was cooler and the atmospheric water vapor content was lower. This is the specific dimension of the current heat wave's unusual character that is most directly connected to the longer-term trajectory of the climate system. And it is the connection that the atmospheric scientists discussing the second question, whether the unusual character reflects a change in how heat waves form, are most focused on. The nighttime temperature anomaly, the specific failure of the normal nocturnal cooling that is one of the most physiologically significant differences between the current event and historical analogs, is not a coincidental feature of the current blocking pattern. It is a predictable consequence of the elevated ocean temperatures and the increased atmospheric water vapor that are the direct result of the global warming that has occurred over the past several decades. A heat wave with the same blocking pattern, the same peak daytime temperatures, and the same atmospheric dynamics would produce different nighttime temperatures today than it would have produced in 1990 or in 1970, because the boundary conditions, specifically the ocean temperature and the atmospheric moisture content, have changed in ways that systematically elevate the overnight minimum temperature baseline. The implication of this connection is that the answer to the second question, whether the unusual character of the current event reflects a systemic change in heatwave behavior, is yes, at least in the specific dimension of nighttime temperature recovery. The heat waves that will occur in future decades under continued warming will systematically produce lower nighttime recovery than the heat waves of the historical record, because the ocean will be warmer, the atmospheric moisture will be higher, and the downward long-wave radiation from the warm, moist atmosphere will be greater. The heat health thresholds that were calibrated against the historical record of heat wave events, the temperature and humidity combinations that trigger the public health advisory levels and the emergency response protocols, were calibrated against events that had more nighttime cooling than current and future events will have, and they are therefore systematically underestimating the risk of events like the current one. The public health infrastructure for responding to heat waves was developed primarily in response to the major heat wave disasters of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The 2003 European heat wave, which killed approximately 70,000 people across the continent with the largest death tolls in France and Italy, was the event that most dramatically exposed the inadequacy of the existing public health response systems, and that drove the most significant improvements in heat health surveillance, early warning systems, and emergency response protocols in the countries most affected. The lessons learned from 2003 were incorporated into revised heat health action plans that have since been implemented in most European countries and that have been credited with substantially reducing the mortality from subsequent major heat events. The improvements implemented after 2003 focused primarily on the dimensions of heatwave risk that the 2003 event most clearly exposed. The vulnerability of elderly people living alone in urban heat islands, the inadequacy of cooling infrastructure in residential settings, the failure of the health system to recognize and respond to the scale of heat-related mortality, and the absence of organized outreach to the most vulnerable populations during extreme heat events. The improvements, where they have been implemented, have made a real difference. Comparative studies of major heat events before and after the 2003 reforms show substantially reduced mortality for comparable temperature anomalies in the post-reform period in the countries that implemented the most comprehensive reforms. But the reforms were calibrated to the characteristics of the 2003 type of heat wave, a prolonged extreme heat event in which the primary risk pathway was through the dehydration and cardiovascular strain experienced by elderly, isolated, vulnerable people. The current heat wave is presenting a different risk profile, one in which the high humidity component and the high nighttime temperature component and the rapid onset component are expanding the vulnerable population beyond the categories that the 2003 reforms specifically targeted, and in which the physiological mechanisms producing the health consequences are different in ways that may require different clinical responses. The specific clinical difference is in the distinction between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Heat exhaustion, the milder of the two major categories of heat illness, produces symptoms of heavy sweating, weakness, cold or pale or clammy skin, a weak but rapid pulse, nausea, and possible fainting. And it is treated primarily by moving the affected person to a cool environment and providing fluids. Heat stroke, the more severe and potentially fatal category, produces core body temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, hot and dry or hot and moist skin, a rapid, strong pulse, possible loss of consciousness, and requires emergency cooling treatment. In standard dry heat events, the progression from heat exhaustion to heat stroke typically follows a pattern in which the early warning signs of heat exhaustion are detectable before the life-threatening threshold is reached. The time window for effective intervention is measured in hours. In the high humidity conditions of the current event, the physiological progression from heat exhaustion to heat stroke can be substantially faster because the impaired sweating efficiency means that the body's core temperature is rising faster for a given level of heat exposure than it would in dry conditions. People who believe they are experiencing manageable heat exhaustion based on their experience with previous dry heat events may be approaching heat stroke thresholds faster than they recognize, and the symptomatic presentation may be less clearly differentiated than in dry heat, making the clinical assessment more difficult. The emergency department presentations that the nurse described as progressing faster than expected and occurring at lower temperatures than she expected are consistent with this mechanism, consistent with a population that has calibrated its self-assessment of heat stress risk to previous dry heat events, and that is being caught out by the different kinetics of heat illness in a high humidity environment. The urban heat island effect is a component of the current heat wave's unusual character that amplifies the other unusual dimensions in the most densely populated parts of the affected region. Urban areas, characterized by high concentrations of heat-absorbing surfaces, reduced vegetation, waste heat from energy use, and the reduced wind speeds that result from the aerodynamic roughness of the built environment, consistently produce temperatures several degrees higher than the surrounding rural areas during heat events. The urban heat island effect has been extensively documented and is incorporated into the surface temperature measurements that form the basis for heat wave monitoring, but its specific amplification of the nighttime temperature anomaly during the current event is receiving specific attention because it is producing conditions in the densest urban areas that are qualitatively different from conditions in the suburbs and the rural surroundings. The mechanism is straightforward in its physics, but severe in its consequences. Urban surfaces, particularly the high thermal mass materials of concrete and asphalt that dominate urban land cover, absorb heat from solar radiation during the day and release it as long-wave radiation after sunset, maintaining elevated temperatures throughout the night. In a standard heat wave with adequate nighttime cooling in the surrounding rural environment, this urban heat storage effect produces urban nighttime temperatures that are warmer than rural temperatures, but that still decline through the night to a level that allows some thermal recovery for urban residents. In a heat wave with the anomalously high overnight minima of the current event, the urban heat storage is adding to an already elevated baseline, producing urban overnight temperatures that are in some cases only 3 or 4 degrees Celsius below the daytime peak, an overnight cooling range that is physiologically insufficient for the recovery of people who have been under significant heat stress during the day. The practical consequence of this inadequate urban overnight cooling is that the cumulative heat load experienced by urban residents during the current event is substantially larger than the heat load experienced by people in the same region in less urbanized settings, and the depletion of physiological resources that is occurring in urban populations is proportionally greater. Urban residents who believe they are getting adequate overnight recovery because they are in air-conditioned spaces may be correct in that assessment, but those who are relying on natural ventilation through open windows, even with fans, are experiencing conditions that the ventilation is insufficient to adequately cool. The specific thermal dynamics of multi-story residential buildings during extended high heat, high humidity events are one of the less discussed but practically significant aspects of the current heat wave's unusual character. Buildings in the affected region that were designed for temperate climates with materials and construction approaches that optimize thermal mass for winter heating retention are behaving as heat sinks during the current event, absorbing heat through their facades and roofs during the day and releasing it into the interior spaces through the night. Residents on upper floors, where the accumulated heat from the building's fabric is most concentrated, are experiencing temperatures that may be significantly higher than the exterior ambient temperature in the late night and early morning hours, when the exterior temperature is at its minimum but the building's thermal mass is still releasing the heat accumulated during the previous afternoon. This building thermal behavior is producing a specific pattern of heat illness risk that is not well captured by the standard outdoor temperature-based heat wave advisories. People who believe they are sheltering from the heat by being indoors may in fact be in environments that are hotter than the exterior at specific times of the day. And the advisory framework that tells people to stay indoors during extreme heat events was designed for heat events in which the building envelope provides genuine thermal protection through the night, which is the standard behavior in dry heat events with adequate overnight cooling. The communication challenge of explaining to the public why this heat wave is more dangerous than its temperature values suggest, when the explanation requires conveying multiple interacting physical mechanisms that are individually understandable but that are unusual in their simultaneous occurrence, is one that the meteorological and public health communities are navigating in real time. The standard heat wave advisory language, with its heat index values and its categories of excessive heat watch and excessive heat warning, was designed to communicate a single integrated metric of heat stress risk in a form that would motivate appropriate protective behavior. It was not designed to communicate the specific combination of dimensions that makes the current event unusual. The adaptation of the communication to convey the unusual character of the current event has been occurring through multiple channels, with the meteorological agencies updating their forecast discussions to highlight the anomalous humidity component and the anomalous nighttime temperatures, and with the public health agencies revising their heat health guidance to emphasize the need for nighttime cooling and to expand their outreach beyond the standard vulnerable population categories to include the additional groups whose risk is elevated by the specific character of the current event. These adaptations are happening in real time during the event, which is not the most effective communication environment. The most effective communication of unusual hazard characteristics occurs before the event begins, in the preparedness messaging that allows people to make informed decisions about their behavior before the conditions are already severe. During an event that is already ongoing and that is already producing health consequences, the communication is necessarily more reactive and more urgent, and the capacity of the population to absorb and act on new information is limited by the heat stress they are already experiencing. The nurse who noticed the unusual pattern in the emergency department case mix is part of this communication challenge in a specific and concrete way. She is one of the points at which the abstract physical description of the heat wave's unusual character is translated into the clinical reality of the people in front of her, and the discrepancy she is observing between the presentations she is seeing and the presentations that the standard heat wave protocols predict is a signal that the protocols need to be updated for this event and for future events with similar characteristics. The update requires a feedback loop between the clinical observations at the front line and the protocol developers at the public health agencies, a loop that exists formally in the public health emergency response system, but that operates on a timescale that is not always fast enough to be useful during a rapidly evolving event. The attending physician who is planning to write up the unusual presentations for the department's quality improvement report is also part of the feedback loop. His observations, aggregated across the emergency departments of the affected region and communicated through the syndromic surveillance systems that public health agencies use to monitor health system burden during extreme weather events, will contribute to the real-time assessment of how the event is affecting the population and to the ongoing revision of the public health response that is occurring throughout the event. The broader scientific question that the current heat wave is raising about the future character of extreme heat events is one that the climate research community has been working on for years, and that the current event is illuminating with a specificity that theoretical analyses cannot fully provide. The question is not simply whether heat waves will become more frequent and more intense in a warmer world, which is one of the most robust projections of climate science and which is well established in the scientific literature. The question is how the specific characteristics of heat waves will change: the humidity component, the nighttime temperature component, the geographic extent, the rate of development, and the duration, and how those specific changes will affect the risk that heat waves pose to human health beyond what the simple intensification of peak temperatures would imply. The current event is providing an observational case study for this question in a way that is simultaneously scientifically valuable and humanly costly. The specific combination of unusual characteristics that the current heat wave is exhibiting, the high humidity, the elevated nighttime temperatures, the rapid onset, the extended duration, is consistent with the theoretical predictions of how heat extremes will change as the climate warms, but seeing it occurring in a real event affecting real populations is different from reading it in a model output or a theoretical analysis. The specific mechanisms are visible in the observational data. The specific consequences are visible in the health data, and the specific gaps between the current heat wave response infrastructure and what the current event requires are visible in the emergency department case mix that the nurse noticed, and in the advisory language that is struggling to convey the event's unusual character. The conclusion that the research community is drawing from the current event is not a new conclusion in the sense of overturning previous understanding. It is a confirmation with unprecedented real-world specificity of a conclusion that the theoretical framework has been producing for years. The heat waves of the future are not going to be like the heat waves of the past in the specific sense that they will have more humidity, less overnight recovery, faster development, and longer duration than historical heat waves with comparable peak temperatures. And these additional characteristics will make them more dangerous than the peak temperature values alone suggest, in ways that the public health response systems that were designed for historical heat waves will need to be revised to address. The revision is not simply a matter of adjusting temperature thresholds upward, of recalibrating the heat wave advisory triggers to account for the warmer baseline. It requires a more fundamental rethinking of how heat stress risk is measured, communicated, and responded to in a climate that is producing a new generation of heat events with a different character from the ones that shaped the current response infrastructure. The wet bulb temperature, which the physiological research has been pointing to for years as a more relevant metric than the standard air temperature or heat index, needs to become a more prominent part of the operational heat wave monitoring and communication framework. The nighttime cooling deficit, the difference between the actual overnight minimum temperature and the minimum that would allow adequate physiological recovery, needs to be incorporated into the risk assessment and the communication in a way that the current framework does not support. The specific vulnerabilities of high-rise residential buildings to the thermal dynamics of high humidity heat events need to be incorporated into the building-specific guidance that is provided to residents during extreme heat events. None of this is simple to implement in an operational framework that serves a heterogeneous population across a large geographic area with varying levels of heat exposure and heat vulnerability. The research exists to support the improvements. The operational and institutional capacity to implement them is a constraint that is being worked on, but that has not been fully overcome. And the current event is demonstrating the human cost of that constraint, with a clarity that will motivate action from the public health and emergency management communities in the event's aftermath. The nurse completed her shift at the end of the night and drove home through streets that were warmer than they should have been at that hour of the morning, past buildings that were releasing the heat they had stored during the previous day into an atmosphere that was too warm and too moist to absorb it quickly. She had 14 cases during her shift that she described afterward as requiring more intensive intervention than she would have expected based on the initial presentation. 14 people whose heat illness progressed faster or presented more severely than her experience with previous heat events had trained her to anticipate. She knew the heat wave was not over. She knew she would be back in the department in 12 hours and that the cases would keep coming. She thought about what she had observed and what it meant and what should be different, and she was already thinking about how to write it up in a way that might actually change something before the next time a heat wave like this one arrived. The heat wave is still ongoing. The atmospheric blocking pattern that is driving it shows no sign of weakening in the near-term forecast. The nighttime temperatures in the most affected areas remain well above the threshold needed for adequate physiological recovery. The cumulative heat load that the population has been experiencing for 7 days is continuing to accumulate, and the scientific and clinical communities that are watching it are doing so with a specific awareness that what they are seeing is not simply an unusually severe version of a familiar phenomenon. They are seeing something that is behaving differently from the heat waves that shaped the systems designed to respond to it, for reasons that are physically understandable and that are connected to changes in the climate system that are not going away. The heat wave is unusual. The unusualness is not accidental. And the questions it is raising about how prepared we are for the heat events that a warming world will continue to produce are questions that the public health and meteorological communities are working to answer as directly and as honestly as the current state of the science and the current state of the operational infrastructure allows. The heat is still here. It is still accumulating. And in the emergency departments of the most affected cities, the nurses and the physicians who are watching what it does to the people who come through the doors are the leading edge of the reckoning that every heat wave eventually produces. The translation of the abstract physics of the atmosphere into the specific and human cost of a world that is warmer than it used to be, and that is producing events that are different from the ones that shaped our response to them. The heat wave is acting very differently from normal. The consequences are not theoretical. The watching continues.